In keeping with our theme in this issue, tables, this is the table that I've got lined up for you. Now this is actually something you might have seen in the background scenes of previous issues. Generally I design a piece of furniture, build it, and it comes out right. This one, there were just some things about it that weren't working for me. So I started to explore a variety of different elements to see what I could come up with in the end. So what you're looking at is actually just a rough prototype. It just never worked for me. One of the elements that I didn't like was my wood selection. I selected a red oak for the framework on it, and it had a bit of curl in it, figure and so forth, but it just, the strong dominant grain of the oak wasn't working for me. So that was one of the changes that I wanted to make. Proportion and scale and so forth, it's very close to what I wanted, but it just needed something extra. Now, David will mention that he feels that this is a Asian design or perhaps Oriental. Myself, it's just, I look at it as my design, my style. It's what I see in my mind when I think of a table of this size. There will be some changes as we go through and build this table, just based on my experience with the prototype, what it is, what I don't like about it. Then along the way we're going to be exploring some different concepts and even some different techniques that you may or may not like. But nonetheless, it should make for a very interesting project and story. Now I will point out right away that some of the decorative elements that I'm going to add to this, you don't need. The table is fine without them. So keep that in the back of your mind as you watch this presentation. Now real briefly, the top is currently maple and will be maple on the new table. Its size and shape is pretty much close to what I want on the final table. The frame dimensionally is very close to what I want. Joinery, very, very simple. We've got bridle joints at the top where the front and back aprons meet up. Then there's a through mortise and tenon joint with the two side apron pieces that go through both the front apron and the leg. Kind of ties everything together with a very strong joint, more so than this size table really needs. But I did like the look of that through tenon in this case. Generally I don't like those, but I just felt it worked well for this design. Now joining the legs at the bottom is a tray or a shelf, if you will. It's joined with simple dado joints to the legs. Again, very simple joinery there. We've got these two uprights in the back that support the medallion. These are joined at the top and bottom with mortise and tenon joinery. Again, very simple, very easy. The medallion is currently just glued onto these two rails, but we might try something a little bit different, but I think we'll just go with simply gluing it on. There's not a whole lot of stress that's going to be applied to that medallion other than it defeating gravity to hold itself up. Now, because all these components are machined very similarly, it's almost all flat and square stock, rather than go through a component by component construction presentation, we'll take the alternative route, and that's the process of building the table. So in other words, we won't focus on any given component other than perhaps the top and the medallions later. Everything else we'll just kind of start out with preparing the material, machining the various joints, and so forth along the way. So our first step is to get this out of the way, get our material on the workbench, and start selecting it and finding out what we've got good and what we've got bad with it. Now I'll be working with hard maple, and I purchased this at the same time I purchased the material for the last issue, and that presented me a number of problems. Luckily so far, because this project is going to be primarily stained, I'm not too worried about the coloring. Most of the boards are good and flat and straight. Some of them, however, are presenting me a few challenges. This is the material for the legs. It's roughly 1.5 inches thick, and it was nice and straight and flat when I brought it into the shop, but it's taken on a bit of twist. So that one's going to have to be worked in extensively to get it flattened out. Now luckily the legs are very small relative to the overall piece here, so I can actually cut this down and run it over the jointer and so forth, minimizing the amount of work I have to do. This board I selected for the top. It was had a nice amount of grain in it. I wanted that extra texturing in there. It's wide enough and it's long enough. But after getting it into the shop and letting it sit, it really warped and twisted and it did everything to me. Luckily it's about 1 inch thick, and I want the top to be somewhere between 5/8 and 3/4, ideally closer to 3/4. So I don't even know if I can save this piece, because what I have to do to get it flat is, of course, remove the high spots and then get a surface flat, flip it over, remove the high spots, and then get it in an even thickness by running it through the planer. This one's going to wait until the end. I'm hopefully going to come up with some magical way of getting this board saved, because it is a very pretty piece of maple. So we'll save the top until later. Because this is hard maple, and because of the twist and so forth, and because of its thickness, I'm not going to try and rip it to a narrower width for further processing. So I decided to do it the safe way over here at the bandsaw. Now that the material is cut to a width that my jointer can accept, my jointer being a 6-inch jointer, my boards must be 6 inches or less in width. I'll carefully pass each of the boards over, getting a nice flat face on each of the boards. That becomes our primary and our starting reference point for all further machining operations. The material for the bottom shelf was one whole board, but it had some twist in it. So what I'm doing is I cut it in half, and then I face planed it on the jointer to flatten up one face on it. Now what I'm going to do is glue it back together again, of course gluing up the two edges that were originally ripped apart. Hopefully that glue line will just disappear and your eye will never see it. So that explains this little glue up. I'll just get this glue spread around, clamp it up, and then we can go on with the processing like we do all the other material. Now the bottom surface is the one that I face planed. So what I'm doing is pushing that down flat against my clamp bar. And then I'll just add a couple more clamps and we'll be good to go. What I'm doing now is getting my surface planer set up for planing the boards to thickness. There's really not a lot of work or effort or thought that really has to go into this machine. This is the surface that I ran over the jointer. It is now straight and flat. That's the surface I want down against my bed on the planer. Now what I'm going to do is just start passing it through, taking probably a 1/64 to a 32nd of an inch per pass. Once I get this top surface cleaned up 100%, then I'll flip it over, clean up this surface, and what I'll try to do is take off equal amounts from both faces. That's in hopes that I'll stabilize the material and it won't warp, twist, or cup any further. Now that the board is flat and straight, as well as both faces are parallel to each other, we need to turn our attention to jointing the edge. Of course, the joiner is the tool of choice for that. We'll get a nice straight edge on there, and that'll prepare us for the ripping operation. Now at this point, I've got the material planed to thickness, one edge jointed so it's nice and square and straight. Here's the material for the bottom shelf, 5/8 inch thick. This is the material for the aprons and the two back bars, and the material for the legs. Now we'll go through, rip them to width, and then we'll follow that up with cutting each of the pieces off to their finished overall length. I've gone through, trimmed up one end. Now what I'll do is cut off all of my legs to the proper overall length. To make sure they're all four the same length, I'm using a stop block. Now there's another critical step here. What I'm going to do is number both sides of my cut line, and I want to keep that waist piece. That'll be important a little bit later on. But for now, let's just get all the legs and other narrow pieces cut off to their length. What I'm going to try to do, I'm not going to be able to achieve it completely, but there's this dark green pattern here, kind of wild looking, kind of cool, and I'm going to try to get that somewhat centered as best I can. It's not going to work out perfectly, but we'll do our best to get it pretty close. Now I'm using my panel cutting jig here at the table saw because the compound miter saw can't handle this wide of a cut. Now, as I mentioned, when you cut off your leg portion, keep the end cut near the foot area. What we're going to do with that end cut, we need to have a piece that's 2.5 inches long. And then what we'll do is we'll swing it around and glue it right back onto the outside edge of the leg. Then we'll contour that using the bandsaw and some drum sander. We'll contour that to create that curved foot area. By using the same piece of material that came off the end of the board, chances are really good that the grain and color will match up real nice and that the glue line should disappear nicely. Now, this is an old cabinet making trick, and it's strictly to help save on wood, to maximize your yield. Otherwise, if you were to make that curved area out of a solid piece, all of this would be waste wood, and it would also make it more difficult to machine this surface. So that's what I'll do, is I'll cut these off at 2.5 inches long and glue them back onto the sides of the legs they came from. However, before I glue on that foot area, what I want to do is get my joinery machining out of the way while the piece is in a nice square rectangular shape that's easy to manipulate. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is to put in our mortise, the through mortise, where the side aprons come all the way through. Now, we do want that exit surface, or the opening, to be nice and square and so forth. So if you have a bad chisel for your hollow chisel mortiser, you may want to hand cut these. Being a 1/4 inch wide, it can be a bit of a pain. So I'm just using the hollow chisel mortiser, and my chisel seems to be working out real nice for that. Again, those are through mortises. Now, over here at the hollow chisel mortiser, you'll see I've got some backer blocks, and I'll want to use a fresh piece when I'm drilling through, and that'll prevent some of the tear out on the back side. But I've got my layout done. I've got a 1/4 inch square mortising bit installed, so it's a real easy process now to just machine those mortises. Near the foot area on each of the legs, we need to machine a dado on one edge and one face. Now, be very careful laying this out so that you end up with the proper number of left and right legs, as well as with those grooves on both the fronts and backs where needed. But the setup and operation is very simple. I've installed the 5/8 inch wide stacked dado head cutter, and I've also got my miter gauge set up on the table saw here. I've raised the blade up 1/4 inch, and I've set a stop block so that I can take the one cut across the edge, rotate the part 90 degrees, and take the second cut across the face. And that should ensure that both of those dados line up nicely. Now, these dados will be accepting that bottom shelf. What you just seen me machine is the bridle joint that'll accept the front and back aprons. It's centrally located along the edge at the top of our legs, 3/16 on each side and 3/4 inch through, 1.5 up. And it does intersect our mortise. Now, do be sure to use a backer board. That will help prevent chip out, as you can see here, where that cutter comes through. By using the backer board, this gets the chip out and not the finished piece that we're trying to make. Other than that, the setup is real simple. 3/4 inch stacked dado head cutter, raised up 1.5 inches. Now you will probably need an 8-inch diameter stacked dado head cutter to reach that height. There are many other options for, of course, cutting a bridle joint like that. I'm using my shop-made tenoning jig, which has really become one of my shop favorites around here. Other than that, as you saw, it's quite easy to do. Now that I've got all the machining done and out of the way, I want to rematch up each of the little foot areas. And what I'm going to do, this is how this one continued on. I'll spin it around like so and glue it onto the outside bottom area of the leg. Put that like so. I'll be very careful to line up the bottom good and flush. Then I'll very carefully line up the faces and tighten up the clamp. That's good to go. We'll let that sit aside to dry. Now we can turn our attention to machining the tenons on the various pieces. Now the two 3/4 by 3/4 inch supports that hold up the medallion on the back require a 5/8 inch long tenon. So I've set my rip fence at 5/8 of an inch. My stacked dado head cutter is currently a 1/2 inch wide. I've got it currently raised up at 1/8 of an inch. What I'll do is pass two opposing faces over on each end. Then we'll raise the cutter up to 1/4 inch and then catch the other two faces. And that will give us the size tenon that we desire. Now I'll go through and adjust the fence over so that I end up with 1 1/8 long tenons for the two side rail pieces. Now I'll start out with the saw blade at 1/4 inch high like I had it a moment ago. Of course, I've adjusted the fence over. Now I'll take the two cuts on each of the faces. That'll create a 1/4 inch wide tenon. Then I'll raise the saw blade up to 3/8 of an inch to create the two shoulder cuts. We have just a couple more mortises to machine up before we're finished with that operation. We've got the two that go on the bottom back rail, the two that go on the back edge of the shelf at the bottom. Those will hold the medallion support bars. Then we've got some through mortises on both the front and back apron rails. Now these two and these two are nearly the same setup. There is a difference in position from the back edge of the shelf to where the mortise is and where it's located front to back on the rails. So pay attention to that, because this shelf will actually stick out about 3/16 further than that medallion support rail. So we'll get these 2 or 4 mortises machined, and then we can turn our attention to the through mortises. Now you will have to adjust your fence and set your depth, but it is a 1/4 inch mortise, so we keep the same bit in there. I've added a couple more blocks underneath, adjusted my top clamp. Now what I want to do is slide this forward and backward until I line it up. Clamp that in, and we're ready to cut these. Now as you can see, the length of this mortise goes cross grain. Now I can't fit the board in this way and feed it along as such, so what I have to do is take this in a series of cuts. What I'll do is I've affixed a stop block here, and that'll allow me to make the first cut on the 4 mortises from each end. Then I'll adjust my fence out, take my next cut, and so on. It'll go rather quickly. Now with that cut made, I'll make an adjustment to the fence, and I'll repeat those 4 cuts, and then I'll clean out the area in the middle. One final adjustment, and we're all set. A little bit of touch-up work with a bench chisel, and we're all set. Okay, what I'm doing now is finishing up the layout. We need to make cutouts on the 4 corners to accept the legs, and this of course is the bottom shelf. Now I'll be doing that operation over at the bandsaw, And as long as I am, I might as well get the layouts done for the rest of the pieces. Now these are the front and back aprons, and this would be the bottom edge, and at each end we need a 2.5 inch diameter or 1.25 inch radius flowing out like so. So using a circle template, a drafter's circle template, it's very easy to do that sort of layout. So I'll just pencil that in, and these will be ready. And of course this is a decorative element. Be creative here. If you don't like what you see, come up with something on your own. Now at the foot area of our leg, we've got this little radius that has to go here. Now that radius, of course, is decorative again. And depending on your eye and what your tastes are, you may want a real sharp radius, a shallow, long blending radius, a flat area, perhaps an 1/8 or 1/4 inch flat before it terminates. Again, it's decorative. Do it the way that suits your eye. Myself, I'm using a 5-gallon bucket as my radius gauge. And I'll take it right down to a sharp point. Now for those of you that are a stickler for detail, that works out to about a 6-inch radius here. Now I'll touch up those curves with the oscillating spindle sander. At this point I've gone through and sanded up all the surfaces. I then went through a rough trial assembly to make sure everything's fitting up nicely, made some minor adjustments, and now what I'm going to do is start assembly. What I'm going to do is start with the 2 back legs and the back apron rail. We'll get those assembled. I'll make sure everything's squared up. There's really not a lot of clamping on this one because there isn't a lot to clamp. You've got mortise and tenon joinery here and bridle joints and so forth, so it somewhat restricts your clamping ability. So you have to get things put together, lined up properly, and then kind of let it sit until the glue takes hold. Because of the design of this table, that being everything is pretty well exposed, not a whole lot's concealed anywhere, be careful with how much glue you use. You don't want to have to deal with too much cleanup. So I'll get some glue on each of the bridle joints and then slide the apron on into position there. Now I'll get some glue down in the mortises. Right now I'm looking at the inside back face of the table, and now we can work the side rail in. And of course the other side. What I've got here is a very simple little block of wood with a groove cut in it. And what I'm going to do with that is place this underneath that front apron or the back apron where that mortise and tenon joint is. And that'll allow me to clamp it and draw that tenon so that it sticks out a little bit. What I want, of course, is the shoulders to fit up tightly. Here you can see I've got that block, and then I'll just tighten up the clamp, and that'll pull the tenon joint together nice and tight. Well, after a couple of quick delays there and problems, we got that straightened out. Now we've got to glue together the 2 side rails, the back apron rail, the 2 legs, and I've got the shelf just stuck in between the legs and clamped temporarily in place. That's to keep everything in alignment this way. I then measured the diagonals from here to here and here to here to make sure everything's good and square. Now I'll let this sit for a while until that glue takes hold, and then we can go ahead and put the other half on with this half. Now that the glue's had a chance to set up on this part of the assembly, I can move on. I'm going to get my 2 supports in place that are for the medallion. I'll get those on the 2 back apron. Now I can glue the legs and the front apron together. Now this next part's a little bit on the tricky side for one person, but we need to bring the front and the back together, at least partially. And of course, we're holding a number of components all at the same time. Now with the front and back partially together, I'm going to get glue where The bottom shelf meets up with the lower legs. And of course I'll get glue on the tenons for the medallion supports. And now we sneak this in and get this all lined up and put together. And this is why you can't bring the legs all the way in at this point against the tenons near the apron. Now I'll get the shelf started in on the tenons at the back edge. Then we can start working in the shelf against the legs. Now using those same blocks again, I'll draw the mortise and tenon joints all the way through, making sure they're clamped up good and tight. And then I'll go back to the shelf area and work on that some more. And of course, keep checking things for square. Well, I think everything's fitting up good. We'll let that glue take hold and then we can move on to the next step. Well, I'm still not sure how I want to tackle this top piece yet. I think I can stall for another day or two. So that's going to come out of the way. And I'm going to turn my attention back to finishing. Now I want this lower frame portion to be darker in color, as was the prototype. I want it to have a reddish undertone, but a dark brown, almost black in color. So I'm going to use two different stains. I'll first apply a stain called Red Sienna or Sedona Red, something to that effect. It's an oil-based stain. You can pick it up at your home center. And then I'll follow that up after it dries thoroughly with another stain, and this color will be called Jacobine. And it's a very dark brown with some blackish undertones in it. So I'm hoping the two will blend together and give me the color that I want. I can't use the same stain process that I did on the prototype because that's red oak, and this being white maple or very whitish maple, I know the colors are going to come out completely different. So this is just another one of those experiments. I'm pretty confident though that it'll look good, at least I hope so. Now I've gone through, finished sanded everything, broke all the sharp edges so that it's got a nice comfort level to it. That's a function of taste. Some folks like a much heavier round over, some like almost a knife edge. I myself am somewhere in the middle. I just take sandpaper and clean up the edges. The rest of the piece has all been sanded with 150 grit sandpaper. I don't want to go much finer than that on this hard maple because then the stain starts playing some additional games, we'll say. So hopefully I can avoid some of the blotchiness by just sanding it down with the 150 grit paper. Now I've got the table upside down on my workbench, and I'm going to get the inside area of the top rails. As you can see, this is quite a reddish colored stain. I'm just going to brush it on and let it soak in for a while. I'll work in areas or zones, trying to stay ahead of it. I don't want to get a big old mess going here. But I'll brush it on, let it soak in for a little while, and then I'll wipe off the excess using a rag. And that's about it. The one thing nice about doing the ragging where you brush it off is you can somewhat control the density of the stain, because stain does penetrate, but it also resides on top of the wood surface. As you can see, I'm pretty much working on the bottom surfaces first, and then I'll transition to the front or top surfaces or exposed areas. By doing it this way, I get a little bit better feel for how the finish is working out. And if I don't like something, it's not going to show up real heavily. Not too many people lay on the floor and look underneath a shelf like this, so it gives you a chance to do a little bit of exploring as you get started with the finishing process. Of course, anytime you're wiping, try to wipe with the grain as much as possible. Well, it's been a couple of hours, and I think the red Sedona stain is pretty well dried. So now I'm going for the Jacobine. Obviously, it's almost a black in color. And that's where I'm hoping to get that red undertone with the Sedona Red. And then with this Jacobine, getting that black top. So hopefully it'll all work out. So far it's looking pretty good. But the second coat goes on same as the first coat. Wipe it on liberally. You can use a brush or a rag. Let it soak in for a while. Kind of depends on how hard you want to work it in. If you let it get to that point of being tacky, it gives you a little bit more control as you rub off the excess to get the color that you want, and of course the intensity. So a little bit of experimentation certainly helps out in this case, as is true with all finishing. Well, as it goes sometimes, I didn't let the Sedona red stain dry long enough. So now what's happening is the two colors are mixing much more strongly than I wanted them to. And literally it's changing the color into a greenish yellowish tint. It's just the way it goes sometimes. I'm not overly concerned at this point. What I'm going to do is let the dark stain dry a little bit more than I normally would, and then I'll work it around as it gets to that real tacky stage and try to rub it in and rub out a finish to even out the coloring and to keep it more darkish. If I have to, I can always add a little bit more red after this coat completely dries. As well as, if necessary, I can use a tinted top coat for it to add a little bit more coloring and perhaps even depth to the finish. So even though it's not working out quite as well as planned, you just got to go with the punches sometimes and deal with it. In this case, if it all turns real bad on me, I'm sure I'll come up with a solution somewhere along the way, and I'll keep you posted. Now, as I mentioned when I was having some trouble with this, I said don't panic. And that's really key to getting a staining or even a finishing job completed to your satisfaction. Don't panic. Just about anything and everything can be fixed with a little bit of patience and a little bit of trial and error. Now, as you can see, I've got my blackish browns and my reddish undertone. To correct the problem I had, which, just to quickly refresh you, I had applied the reddish colored stain first and then the blackish colored stain, but I didn't let the reddish colored stain dry long enough, so it lifted off. And it kind of created this yellowish, greenish, frankly, very ugly color. So I just let the black stain cure, dry for a couple of days, and apply another coat of the red stain. And now what I'm doing is just going through a few of the areas and applying a little bit more stain to darken up the areas that I feel are just a teeny bit too light. And to do that, just applying some stain on a rag and then just dabbing it in and wiping it across. And that'll redden it up a little bit and darken it a little bit. So it's just a little bit more tinkering around. Just don't panic and take your time with finishing. Well, I don't think I can delay much further on working the top material. Now, as I mentioned, this is plenty thick. I can probably get a 5/8 inch flat board out of this by working it through. I'm still not real thrilled with it. As you can see, it's warped, it's twisted, cupped. Just about everything that can go wrong did on this particular piece of wood. And the more I've been studying it, the less I actually like it. So I'm not even sure if I really want to go through all the trouble of trying to flatten this piece and machine it up completely, only in the end to go, I really don't like it. So I'm still pondering it. But a couple other things have happened, and this is part of why I've let this board right till the very end here on filming. One, the board was dead flat when I picked it up. I would have never bought a piece of wood this warped, no matter how much figure was in it. So I assumed that there was something going on. Now, of course, I always check my stock with a moisture meter. Now, this particular piece of wood is actually quite consistent in its moisture content. Now, I thought maybe the way I had it stored in here, that it was picking up moisture perhaps from the concrete floor or something, and that introduced some moisture and caused it to change shape dramatically. And I'm sure moisture had something to do with it. But other problems have creeped up as well, and I'll bring you in closer to show you that. Now, one of the things that developed here over the past few days is this split. Unfortunately, I need this board to be exactly 12 inches wide. This split would make me, if I cut it away, is going to drop me down to just under 12 inches, probably 11 15/16. Now for just about any other table that would be perfectly fine, but for what I have in mind, that 12-inch dimension is critical. So there is a way I might be able to work around it, but I think I'm going to have to go back to the sawmill and try and find me another piece of maple that will do. Well, a quick trip to the local mills resulted in nothing, so I'm going to have to try to make do with this board. Now, there's a number of different ways we could work this. I could, of course, cut it down the middle and then run it over my jointer, which is a 6-inch joiner, and this being a 12-inch board, I got to do it in 2 separate pieces, but that, of course, cuts my width down. So my next option is to try and start hand planing this. This is hard maple, it's got some figure in it, and past experiences in hard maple for me in hand planing don't add up to a lot of success, at least not without a tremendous amount of physical labor, of which I'm not really certain I want to commit to this particular piece of timber. My hopes are high, but my expectations are very low to save this. But I've used this technique that I'm about to show you a number of different times. In fact, I even designed a jig to do this with that had a lot more of adjustment in it. But as with any operation where we need to flatten a piece of stock, we have to remove the high spots. Now, this board is twisted, so relative to this surface, these are my 2 high spots. And of course, these 2 corners are the high spots on the opposite face. So what I need to do is come up with a way to hold this thing flat and pass it through my planer. And that will reduce the amount of physical labor I have to commit to doing this board. Now, it's a very, very simple technique. I've got a piece of MDF with a cleat at the leading edge. This will be the edge that gets pulled into the jointer first. This will hold it and allow us to guide it through, but the board can still rock around. A couple of simple wedges will certainly make this board be much more stable. So what I'm going to do is slide, these are identical, it was one wide shim and I split it down the middle. I'll slide one in on this point and one in on this point. Now, because they're the same shape, thickness, and taper and so forth, what I want to do is bring them in so that they're both sticking out equal amounts, and just until it starts to feel like it's lifting the board. Now at this point and this point of the board are equal distances above my carrier board. So right now the board is actually quite stable. There's no rocking at all. I could run it through the jointer, rather the planer like this, but I know what will happen. With the knives vibrating and so forth, these wedges will work themselves loose. So what I'm going to do now is just mark their location as to where they go on the carrier board, and then use some hot glue to help hold it in place. Now, I did have to raid my wife's craft supplies to get this hot melt glue, because I normally don't use this too much out in the shop, but it is very handy for making temporary fixtures and so forth like this. Anything that requires a temporary bond, this stuff's really kind of handy. So I might have to get me one of these little hot glue guns. I'll apply a little bit of hot glue here and glue my board down to the jig. Of course, this craft hot glue is temporary, so it'll come off pretty easily. Now at this point, you get an idea of what I'm dealing with. This is only 1/2 of the twist that's in the board. If I push this opposite corner down tight against our carrier board, this is going to go up, this gap here will be twice as large. So that's actually what I got to compensate for. And out of this, I got to try and get a board that's hopefully 3/4 of an inch thick, but I'll go down to 5/8 if I have to. Now what I'm doing is adjusting my height for the thickness planer so that I start shaving off very thin amounts. I don't want to be aggressive on this. I want to take a series of successive light cuts rather than a couple of heavy ones. Because a heavy cut is going to require that the planer push down harder against our board. And as you can see, it can still flex. So by taking light cuts, we can remove the waste material or the high spots without deforming our board as it's going through the planer. It's going to take a little bit of time, but hopefully it'll be worth it to save this piece. Well, it appears that the trick worked. The board is actually relatively flat, still not perfect, but it's close enough where once it's clamped onto the frame of the table, no one will ever know there's a 32nd of an inch of twist still in it. So that's in pretty good shape. I still have to rip it to width, and hopefully I'll get rid of that one split that's in the board. That's the last real major leap with it. So what I'll do is I'll go through, rip it to exactly 12 inches wide, and I'll trim it off to its overall length of 30.4 inches. Very precise number there. So we'll head over to the table saw and take care of that. I also ran another piece of maple through. This one will become the medallion, and I planed that down to 3/8 of an inch thick as well. And now I'm going to take some time to put a little bit of myself into this table design. Right now I'm working on the medallion that goes in the bottom back area, and I want to have it be somewhat decorative and of course have some meaning to this decoration as well. So what I'm going to do is use the CNC router to put a pattern into the wood, engrave a pattern. Now I need this pattern to be very precise. I wouldn't even attempt to try to do this particular pattern by hand. I know I'm just simply not good enough, and it would be a very difficult thing to do in order to get the precision that I want visually. Now there will be 60 C-shaped hash marks going around. They're all the same radius, but you'll notice that their length is going to get smaller as it progresses from the bottom towards the top. After that, I'll also mill 4 wavy lines along the left edge, and those will run vertically. And there will be 3 waves, or 3 cycles to each of those waves. Again, it looks very attractive to my eye. Other people may not like it, but this is how you put yourself into a project. Now when we get done milling all these decorative etchings into it, the final step will be to mill out the circle. And of course, just for a round medallion like this, you could cut that circle 100 different ways. Bandsaw, you could use a coping saw or a jigsaw, just a wide variety of tools. Of course, lathe comes to mind, routers with jigs, you name it, there's just a myriad of ways to make something round. In my case, I've got a CNC router, and it really makes it easy. The freshly machined medallion. I'll still have to trim up the edge here where I didn't mill all the way through when I cut the circle. I'm going to sand that, of course, off so that it's a flush surface around the edges. And I'll have quite a bit of detail work to do inside these little grooves. They're not going to be perfectly machined. In the areas where you're cutting cross grain, it's a little bit rough. So I'm going to have to go in there and hand sand each one of these 60 grooves there, and then the 4 wavy lines here. Hand sand each one of them to detail them up nice. Now with the top mounted on the CNC router, again I'm going to make it my own. I've come up with a wavy pattern that I want to engrave along the entire surface of the top. There's an awful lot of machining that's going to go on here, and it's going to take roughly an hour and a half even with the CNC router. To machine these grooves, I'm using a 1/4 inch diameter ball nose router bit. I'm moving along at roughly 50 or 60 inches a minute, spindles running at about 12,000 RPM, and we'll just let it run for the next hour and a half or so. After I get done with all that engraving, the next thing I want to do is create a bowl form in the front center of the tabletop. Now again, this has secondary meaning to it and purpose. But it's really quite simple to program and to machine this type of form using a CNC router. We're just going to take a series of circular cuts and step it out on the x-axis for diameter and move it up on the z-axis to control our depth where we machine each of these circles. Now with all the detail work done, we can go back to conventional machining. What I want to do is create that back bevel, or that bevel, at each end of the tabletop. Now these bevels are on the bottom side of the tabletop. Now to do this, I'm using my tenon jig, and I've kind of got things on here backwards. Normally this is the edge of the tenon jig that's toward me, and normally it's on the other side of the fence and so forth. But because I'm doing a beveling operation, I've got my saw blade tilted over at about 15 degrees. You'll have to adjust that to accommodate the thickness of your top and so forth. Now, I do want on the edge about a 1/4 inch flat, and then the rest will be beveled back at that steep angle. So I've gone through, adjusted things around a little bit on the angle and on the fence position to get that bevel. Now we just pass it over, flip the board end for end, and do it a second time. Now over here at the joiner, I've tilted my fence back at about 5 degrees. What I want to do along the front edge and the back edge, create a very, very shallow bevel that bevels down and away as it approaches the bottom of the tabletop. Now I'll just pass it over, taking some very, very light cuts so that I just sneak up on it and don't bevel it too heavily. One of the nice things about all this detail is it really adds visual interest to a piece of furniture like this. One of the bad things is, with 52 continuous wavy grooves running the entire length of this very hard maple, I'll be at this sanding and detailing for quite some time. Perhaps hours, perhaps even weeks. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted my finish to be a very dark brown or blackish color with a reddish undertone. As you can see, I've achieved it, and I'm real happy with what I got. But something somewhere along the way got in the finish and contaminated it. Now, of course, I've got a number of layers of stain on here, and what you're seeing now is actually the 3rd coat of a wipe-on polyurethane. And that's when this started to appear. So I don't think it's an incompatibility issue with the stain and the polyurethane. Rather, I think I've gotten something on the surface of the wood between the polyurethane coats number 2 and number 3. But this horrible appearance here has appeared in a variety of different places on the table. I'm really left with no option. I'm going to have to strip the whole table down, restain it, and refinish it. This is going to cause almost a week of delay, but I really see no option. I wish there was another way, but sometimes a project is going to throw something at you that you have to go back in time to correct. Well, it's been almost 2 weeks since I started finishing on this particular frame, and I'm still having some difficulties with it. However, I don't want to delay the release of this issue any further, so I'm just going to go ahead with the final assembly, and perhaps at a later date I'll go through and refinish the piece. But what we want to do now is focus on getting the top mounted and of course the medallion mounted up against the back here. Now of course there's many different options here, so I'm just going to show you the method that I'll be using. And it's going to start out with using a biscuit joiner to cut some slots on these upper apron rails. With the top upside down on my workbench, I've placed the frame on top of that, centered it up very carefully. Now to hold the top to the frame, I'll be using these simple little metal clips. And you can pick these up at almost any woodworking store. I'll just mark their location, drill the pilot hole, and drive the screws in. And I'll attach it with some number 6 by 1/2 inch sheet metal screws. Now what pleases my eye is to have the center of this medallion 13.5 inches up from this top surface of the shelf. So I've marked 2 locations there, and I'm going to drill some 1/4 inch holes. Now what I'll do is place a dowel center in each of the holes, and that will allow me to transfer the hole location from these 2 bars onto the back of the medallion. And now I can just transfer those hole locations by lining up the medallion by eye and pressing against it. Now what I've got here are a couple of hardwood dowels. I think these are walnut, and I've cut them off to about 1.25 inches long. And I'll insert those into each of these holes. Of course, I'd glue them if this was permanent. Then with those 2 in, we can now pull the medallion in And we're set. Well, there you have it, what I'm calling the unified timetable. Turns out it's actually a fairly easy project to construct. There's a lot of flexibility in its design and styling. Just take your time with the finishing, and things should go much better. Now, some of you may be wondering about some of the elements that I've put into this design. As you very well know, time is a very important part of my life in producing this magazine and getting it out reasonably on schedule. So I've been pondering time quite a bit lately, and this table represents time, at least the way I see it. The tabletop is 30.4 inches long from left to right. You'll remember I was very adamant about that dimension. Turns out that's the average number of days in a month. It's 12 inches wide front to back. Of course, there are 12 months in a year. On the medallion, you'll notice I have 4 wavy lines, constructed of 3 cycles of a sine wave. That represents the 4 seasons in a year, each lasting 3 months. This pattern here represents the 60 seconds and 60 minutes that make up our hours. You'll notice that it starts out wide and the circles or semicircles end up narrow. That is a reflection of the duration of time that is daytime versus nighttime. This bowl area that I machined on the top consists of 12 concentric ridges divided by a line down the center, following the curve of the bowl. There are, of course, 24 hours in a day, and we typically look at that as 2 12-hour segments. There's this wavy pattern that continues completely across the entire surface. There are 52 complete wavy lines. Of course, there are 52 weeks in a year. There are also 7 complete cycles per each wavy line, representing, of course, the 7 days of the week. There's a secondary pattern you'll notice in here. There's an arc that continues around like so. That arc is a symbolic representation, as well as somewhat precise, of the duration of time of daylight versus nighttime on any given day. This portion down here represents our daytime. The upper portion represents the nighttime. Now, I was careful enough to accurately depict this by finding the information on a government website for the longitude and latitude of my geographic location. Now, I did stylize it because it should look like a wave or a sine wave. However, I felt it looked better just as a single curve. And that's why I call it the Unified Timetable. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. See you again in the next issue.